There's something strange about the way we react when someone offers us a simple answer to a complicated question. Something inside us rejects it almost immediately. Not because the answer is wrong, necessarily, but because it feels wrong. It feels too easy, too neat, too much like someone hasn't thought things through properly. We've all experienced this. Someone says something true and straightforward, and instead of relief, we feel a kind of subtle disappointment. Like we've been given directions to a place we thought was further away. The mind doesn't say thank you. It says, "Are you sure?" It says, "But what about?" And then begins listing exceptions, edge cases, complications that may or may not actually exist. And the stranger thing is, we don't realize we're doing this. We think we're being thorough. We think we're being intelligent. But if you watch closely, you'll notice that the resistance doesn't come from logic. It comes from somewhere deeper. It arrives before you've even finished evaluating the answer. It's almost physical, this recoil. And it's not really about the truth of what's being said. It's about what accepting that truth would mean. If the answer is truly simple, then all the time spent circling around it, all the energy invested in considering and reconsidering, starts to feel wasted. Or worse, it starts to feel like maybe you didn't need to suffer through all that confusion in the first place. The mind protects itself from this realization by insisting the answer can't be that simple. There must be more to it. There must be something we're missing. And so we keep searching, not because we haven't found the answer, but because we can't allow ourselves to believe we already have. This pattern shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. In conversations, in therapy, in those late-night moments when someone says something obvious and kind, and instead of letting it land, you brush it aside. You say, "Yeah, but it's more complicated than that." And maybe it is. Or maybe that's just what the mind does when it encounters something it didn't have to work for. There's a kind of mistrust we've developed toward easy answers. We've learned to associate difficulty with value, complexity with depth. So when truth arrives without the usual struggle, we assume it must be shallow. We assume it's for beginners, for people who haven't thought things through as carefully as we have. But what if that assumption is backwards? What if the reason simple truths feel uncomfortable is not because they're incomplete, but because accepting them would require us to let go of the identity we've built around being someone who wrestles with difficult questions? And here's where it gets interesting. Because the mind doesn't just reject simple answers in obvious ways. It's far more subtle than that. It creates the illusion of openness while quietly reinforcing the same patterns. It says, "Yes, I'm open to simple answers. I just want to make sure I understand fully." Which sounds reasonable, which sounds like wisdom. But if you listen closely, that same sentence gets repeated year after year, with the understanding never quite arriving. Not because it can't arrive, but because arrival would mean the search is over. And the search, it turns out, has become more familiar than the destination. The question starts to feel safer than the answer. And without realizing it, we begin to prefer the not knowing. Because at least in the not knowing, we still get to feel like we're moving towards something. Complexity offers something that simplicity doesn't. It offers cover. When things are complicated, when there are multiple layers and conflicting perspectives and endless nuance to consider, you can always say you're still figuring it out. You're not wrong, you're just exploring. You're not lost, you're being thorough. And there's safety in that. Because as long as things remain complex, you don't have to commit. You don't have to take a stand. You don't have to be the person who believed something simple and turned out to be mistaken. Complexity allows you to hedge, to keep your options open, to remain in a state of permanent consideration. And the mind loves this state. It feels productive. It feels intelligent. It feels like you're doing something, even when you're not actually moving forward. But there's another reason complexity feels safe, and it's less obvious. Complexity makes you need it. If the answer to something is genuinely simple, then anyone can understand it. Anyone can arrive at the same conclusion. Your particular way of thinking, your specific knowledge, your carefully developed analytical skills, they stop being necessary. And for many of us, especially those who've built an identity around being the person who thinks deeply, who sees what others miss, who understands the layers beneath the surface, this is threatening. Not consciously, maybe, but somewhere inside, there's a fear that if things are simple, then maybe we're not as special as we thought. Maybe our intelligence, which we've relied on for so long to set us apart, to make us valuable, to give us a sense of worth, Maybe it doesn't matter as much as we believed. So we make things complex, not because they need to be, but because we need them to be. You see this in academic writing sometimes. Ideas that could be expressed in a single clear sentence get stretched across pages, wrapped in jargon, hedged with qualifications and caveats until the original point is barely visible. And when someone asks what it means, the author says, well, it's complicated. Which is true, but only because it's been made complicated. The complexity isn't in the idea itself. It's in the presentation. It's in the need to demonstrate that this required serious thought, serious expertise, serious intelligence to understand. And once you start recognizing this pattern, you see it everywhere. In business meetings where simple decisions get delayed pending further analysis. In friendships where straightforward conversations get replaced with careful, diplomatic maneuvering. In your own mind, where a clear instinct gets overridden by endless second-guessing. We've learned to distrust clarity and to trust confusion, because confusion feels more substantial. And the strange thing is, this habit often gets rewarded. In school, the longer answer usually gets the better grade. In professional settings, the person who can make things sound more complicated often seems more competent. In social situations, the person who sees problems where others see solutions often seems more thoughtful. So the mind learns. It learns that complexity is valuable, that nuance is sophisticated, that simple answers are for simple people. And over time, this learning becomes automatic. You stop choosing complexity deliberately. It becomes your default. The mind starts adding layers before you even realize it's doing so. What begins as a protective strategy becomes a way of seeing the world. And once that shift happens, simple truths don't just feel uncomfortable. They start to feel impossible, like something that might work for other people in other situations, but surely not for you. Not for this, not right now. There's a particular kind of thinking that doesn't actually want to arrive anywhere. It wants to stay in motion. It moves from question to question, consideration to consideration, never quite settling, never quite concluding. And from the inside, this feels like diligence. It feels like you're being responsible, making sure you've thought things through before making a decision or forming an opinion. But if you watch this process closely, you'll notice something. The thinking doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to more thinking. Each answer generates 3 new questions. Each conclusion gets immediately qualified, revised, reconsidered. The mind is extraordinarily busy, but nothing actually changes. And that's not an accident. That's the point. This kind of thinking serves a very specific function. It keeps you from having to act. As long as you're still thinking, still analyzing, still trying to understand all the angles, you have a perfect excuse for not moving forward. You can't be blamed for inaction when you're clearly working so hard to figure things out. You can't be accused of avoidance when you're obviously engaging with the problem. And this is where thinking becomes a shield. Not against external criticism, necessarily, but against the internal discomfort of actually choosing something, committing to something, being definite about something. Because once you choose, you can be wrong. Once you commit, you can fail. Once you're definite, you can be proven mistaken. But while you're still thinking, you're protected. You're in process. You haven't made the error yet. And the mind is very good at disguising this. It doesn't say, I'm afraid to choose. It says, I want to make the right choice. It doesn't say, I'm avoiding commitment. It says, I'm being careful. It doesn't say, I'm using thinking as a way to hide. It says, I'm being thorough, responsible, mature. And all of that might be true, to a point. But there's a difference between thinking that moves toward resolution and thinking that circles in place. The first kind has an endpoint. The second kind has a perpetual excuse. And the mind learns to prefer the second kind, not because it's more effective, but because it's safer. It creates the appearance of engagement without the risk of actually being engaged. You can spend years this way, decades even, reading books, listening to podcasts, going to therapy, having long conversations with friends about what you should do, what you really want, what the right path might be. And all of it can feel productive. All of it can feel like progress. But underneath, there's often a quiet awareness that nothing is actually changing. The same questions come up again and again. The same uncertainties resurface. And instead of recognizing this as a pattern, as a way the mind is protecting itself from having to take a risk, we interpret it as evidence that the situation really is as complicated as it feels. We tell ourselves, if I haven't figured it out yet, it must be because there's more to understand. Not because thinking has become the avoidance. Not because the shield has become so familiar we've forgotten we're holding it. Underneath most of this, if you go deep enough, you find a very simple fear. The fear of being wrong. Not wrong in some abstract, philosophical sense, but wrong in a way that gets noticed. Wrong in a way that makes you look foolish, naive, like someone who didn't think things through. We've all experienced this. That hot flash of embarrassment when you realize you misunderstood something or stated something confidently that turned out not to be true. The way people's faces change. The subtle shift in how they see you. And the mind learns from this. It learns that being wrong costs something. Not just in that moment, but in how you're perceived afterward. So it develops strategies to avoid that cost. One strategy is to never be definite. If you always qualify your statements, always add caveats, always say, well, it depends, or I could be wrong, but then you can never be fully wrong. You've protected yourself in advance. You've made it clear that you were aware of the complexity, that you were being humble, that you weren't claiming to know for certain. And if things turn out differently than you suggested, you can point back to those qualifications and say, see, I said it was complicated. This feels like intellectual honesty. And sometimes it is. But other times, it's just fear dressed up as humility. A way to participate in conversations, to offer opinions, to seem engaged, without ever actually exposing yourself to the vulnerability of being straightforwardly wrong. Another strategy is to align yourself with complexity itself. If you make it known that you see layers others don't, that you understand nuance, that you're skeptical of simple explanations, then even when you're wrong about specifics, you can still be right about the general principle that things are complicated. You can say, well, yes, that particular analysis didn't pan out, but the broader point stands, which is that these issues are never as simple as they seem. And again, this might be true, but it's also a very effective way to avoid accountability. Because if simple answers are always suspicious and complexity is always appropriate, then you can be wrong about details while still maintaining your identity as someone who thinks deeply. The fear of being wrong gets transferred from specific claims to the general posture, and the general posture, being vague enough, becomes almost impossible to prove wrong. But the deepest strategy, the one that's hardest to see, is to avoid knowing in the first place. If you never let yourself settle on an answer, never let yourself believe something fully, never let yourself relax into a conclusion, then you can't be wrong because you never claim to be right. You're just exploring, considering, holding space for multiple possibilities. And this sounds very wise. It sounds like the position of someone who's transcended the need to be right, who's comfortable with uncertainty, who's mature enough to live with ambiguity. But if you sit with it long enough, you might notice that it doesn't feel like wisdom. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like you're carrying every possibility at once, never able to put any of them down, because putting them down would mean choosing, and choosing would mean risk. And the mind, in its attempt to avoid the pain of being wrong, creates a different kind of pain. The pain of never being allowed to rest in knowing anything at all. For some people, being smart isn't just a trait. It's who they are. It's the thing that made them feel special as a child, the thing teachers praised, the thing that set them apart from siblings or classmates who were better at sports, more popular, more confident in social situations. Being intelligent became the one thing they could count on, the one place they felt secure. And when that happens, when your sense of worth gets deeply entangled with your ability to think, to analyze, to understand things others don't, then anything that threatens that ability becomes terrifying. Not just uncomfortable, but fundamentally destabilizing. And simple truths threaten that ability in a very particular way. If something is obvious, if anyone could understand it without special training or careful thought, then what's the point of being intelligent? If the answer doesn't require the very thing you've built your identity around, then where does that leave you? This is why people who pride themselves on their intelligence often have the hardest time with simple answers. Not because they can't understand them, but because understanding them feels like a demotion. It feels like being brought down to a level where everyone else already is, where the thing that made them special, the thing that made them valuable, no longer applies. So they reject the simple answer, not intellectually, but emotionally. They need it to be more complicated so that they can still be the person who sees the complexity. This shows up in the way people talk. Sometimes there's a certain style of speaking that's designed to demonstrate intelligence in every sentence. Long words where short ones would do. Abstract concepts where concrete examples would be clearer. A kind of performance of thinking where the goal isn't really communication, but demonstration. Demonstrating that the speaker is someone who operates at a higher level, who has access to frameworks and vocabularies that others don't. And if you question this, if you ask, could you say that more simply, there's often resistance. Not because the idea can't be said more simply, but because saying it simply would remove the marker that this person is intelligent. The complexity isn't protecting the idea. It's protecting the identity. And the sad thing is, this creates a kind of isolation. Because if you can only feel valuable when you're being smarter than the people around you, then you can never fully relax into connection. There's always a part of you evaluating, comparing, making sure you're still the one who understands more, sees deeper, thinks more carefully. Conversations stop being exchanges and start being opportunities to demonstrate your intelligence. Friendships become hierarchical, with you needing to be the one who offers insights rather than receives them. And all of this happens underneath conscious awareness, driven by a fear that's hard to admit, which is that if you're not the smart one, then who are you? If your intelligence doesn't set you apart, what's left? And the mind, trying to protect you from having to answer that question, keeps adding layers, keeps making things complex, keeps resisting the simple truths that everyone else can see. Not because those truths are wrong, but because accepting them would mean letting go of the only identity you've ever trusted. There's something almost romantic about the search. The person who's always seeking, always questioning, always on a journey toward understanding. It suggests depth, sincerity, humility. It suggests someone who hasn't settled for easy answers, who's willing to keep looking even when it's difficult. And culturally, we celebrate this. We admire the seeker more than the person who's found. Because finding suggests you've stopped, and stopping suggests you've given up, or worse, that you've deceived yourself into thinking you know something when really you don't. So we learn to value the searching itself, independent of whether it actually leads anywhere. But if you examine this closely, you'll notice something strange. The search often continues long past the point where an answer has become clear. You'll see people who know what they need to do, what change they need to make, what truth they need to accept, but they keep searching anyway. They read another book. They try another framework. They have another conversation with someone wise, asking questions they've already asked before, receiving answers they've already received. And they nod, and they say, yes, that's helpful, and then they continue searching. Not because they haven't found, but because finding would mean the search is over. And the search has become too important to let go of. Part of this is practical. If you're searching, you have a reason to engage with new ideas, new teachers, new communities. You're always a student, which is a comfortable position. Students are allowed not to know. Students are allowed to make mistakes. Students are protected by the fact that they're still learning. But if you stop being a student, if you say, I've learned enough, I understand now, then suddenly you're responsible. You're accountable. You can't claim ignorance anymore. You can't say, I'm still figuring it out. You have to act on what you know, and actions have consequences. So the mind keeps you searching, keeps you in the student role, because it's safer than graduating into someone who actually has to live according to what they've learned. But there's something deeper, too. The search gives life a kind of structure. It gives you something to do with your attention, something to organize your days around. Wake up, read something meaningful, reflect, journal, listen to something wise before bed. There's a rhythm to it, a sense of purpose. And if the search ends, if you allow yourself to rest in having found, then what? What do you do with your time? What do you do with all that energy that was directed towards seeking? The mind doesn't know, and not knowing is uncomfortable, so it keeps the search going. It invents new questions, new areas of uncertainty, new levels of understanding that must be reached. And this can continue indefinitely. You can be searching your entire life, always feeling like you're close to some breakthrough, some final understanding, some moment where it all clicks. But the moment never comes. Not because the understanding isn't available, but because arriving at it would mean letting go of the identity of the person who's still searching. And that identity, it turns out, has become more important than whatever you thought you were searching for. Overthinking and wisdom can look very similar from the outside. Both involve slowing down, considering carefully, not jumping to conclusions. Both seem to involve a kind of depth, a refusal to accept surface-level explanations. But inside, they feel completely different. Wisdom feels quiet. It feels like clarity arriving without force. Overthinking feels noisy. It feels like effort, like churning, like the same thoughts cycling through again and again without resolution. Wisdom brings relief. Overthinking brings exhaustion. But the mind has learned to confuse the two, because they share enough surface features that you can convince yourself one is the other. Overthinking often starts with a legitimate question or concern, something genuinely worth considering. But instead of considering it, arriving at a conclusion, and moving on, the mind keeps going. It loops back, re-examines from a different angle, introduces hypothetical scenarios, considers what might happen if, what could go wrong, what others might think. And because all of this feels like thinking, it gets labeled as productive. It gets labeled as being thorough, being responsible, being wise. But wisdom doesn't loop. Wisdom sees clearly and then stops. It doesn't need to keep thinking once the relevant insight has arrived. Overthinking can't stop because it's not actually trying to reach a conclusion. It's trying to avoid the discomfort that would come with reaching one. And there's a kind of permission we give ourselves when we're overthinking. We say, I just need to think this through, which sounds reasonable. But what it often means is, I need to keep thinking until I feel completely certain, until all anxiety has dissolved, until there's no possibility of regret or mistake or discomfort. And that state never comes. Certainty of that kind doesn't exist. So the thinking continues, and the mind interprets the continuation as evidence that more thinking is needed. It doesn't occur to us that maybe thinking isn't the tool for this particular problem. Maybe some things can only be resolved by acting, by choosing, by living your way into the answer rather than thinking your way there. But admitting that would require admitting that all this thinking, all this careful consideration, all these hours spent turning the problem over in your mind, might not have been as valuable as you believed. And the mind resists that admission. It protects the value of thinking because thinking is what it does. It's the mind's contribution. So it keeps imitating wisdom, keeps creating the appearance of depth, keeps cycling through the same considerations in slightly different forms, and calls it reflection, calls it growth, calls it being thoughtful. And meanwhile, the actual answer, which was probably clear somewhere around the 5th minute of the first time you thought about this, sits quietly underneath all the noise, waiting. Not demanding, not insisting, just there, available, whenever you're ready to stop thinking and simply see. There's a very particular kind of relief that comes when you finally allow something to be simple. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. But there's a feeling of something releasing, like you've been holding tension you didn't even know was there, and suddenly it lets go. The problem you thought required hours of analysis turns out to have an obvious answer. The decision you've been agonizing over becomes clear the moment you stop trying to think your way through it. And in that moment, there's a kind of quiet surprise. Not at the answer itself, but at how much energy you were spending keeping things complicated. This relief is different from solving a difficult problem. When you solve something genuinely complex, there's satisfaction, accomplishment, the pleasure of having worked hard and succeeded. But this is gentler. It's more like remembering something you already knew. Like coming home after a long trip and realizing your own bed is more comfortable than anywhere you stayed. There's no achievement in it. Just recognition. Oh, it says, it was this all along. And part of the relief is in how much you get to stop doing. You get to stop analyzing. Stop considering all the angles. Stop protecting yourself from oversimplifying. You just let the thing be what it is, and that's enough. But getting to this point usually requires letting go of something. Letting go of the belief that if it were really that simple, you would have seen it sooner. Letting go of the need to demonstrate that you've been thorough, that you've done your due diligence, that you're not someone who settles for easy answers. Letting go of the identity of being the person who sees complexity everywhere. And that's hard, because those things have been useful. They've protected you in certain ways. They've made you feel intelligent, careful, responsible. So when you let them go, there's often a moment of vulnerability. A moment where you're not sure who you are without all that thinking, all that complexity, all that careful consideration. But if you can stay with that vulnerability, something shifts. You realize you're still here, still yourself, just quieter, just simpler, just a little more at ease. And once you experience this relief, even once, it becomes easier to recognize when you're making things complicated again. You start to notice the tension that comes with overthinking, the subtle exhaustion of holding multiple perspectives at once, the way your shoulders tighten when you're resisting a simple answer. And you can choose differently. Not always. Not perfectly. But sometimes. You can let yourself say, maybe it really is that straightforward. Maybe I don't need to think about this for 3 more hours. Maybe the obvious answer is obvious because it's true. And each time you do this, each time you choose simplicity, even though the mind is offering you complexity, the relief comes a little faster. The release happens a little sooner. Until eventually, simple stops feeling like something you're settling for and starts feeling like coming home. Like the place you were trying to get to all along, before you convinced yourself you needed to take the long route. Sometimes clarity just arrives. You're not working for it. You're not analyzing or trying to figure anything out. You might be washing dishes or walking or staring out a window, and suddenly something becomes obvious that was murky before. A decision that felt impossible becomes simple. A situation you couldn't make sense of suddenly makes perfect sense. And the strange thing is, nothing changed in the external situation. The clarity didn't come from gathering more information or thinking more carefully. It came from stopping, from letting your mind be quiet for a moment, from not trying. This is deeply counterintuitive to the way most of us have been taught to approach problems. We've learned that understanding comes from effort, from work, from applying ourselves. And that's true for certain kinds of problems. If you're learning mathematics or trying to understand a complex system, effort is required. But there's another kind of understanding that works differently. It works through release, through letting go of the need to understand, through trusting that clarity will come when it's ready, not when you demand it. And this kind of understanding is often deeper, more reliable, than the understanding you force through sheer mental effort. You can see this in creative work sometimes. A writer struggling with a chapter, trying to think their way through it, getting more and more tangled. Then they go for a walk, forget about the chapter entirely, and the solution appears fully formed. They weren't working on it consciously, but something in them was working on it, in a way that couldn't happen while they were trying. The effort was actually in the way. And when they stopped making effort, when they stopped trying to force clarity, clarity came on its own. Not as a reward for their earlier effort, but as a result of finally stopping. But this requires a kind of trust that's hard to develop. Trust that you don't have to be in control of the process. Trust that your mind knows how to solve problems without your conscious direction. Trust that clarity is available, that it's not something you have to create, but something you allow. And most of us aren't taught this. We're taught the opposite, that if you want something, you have to work for it. That passive waiting is lazy, unproductive, a waste of time. So when clarity tries to arrive on its own, we often interrupt it. We grab onto it too quickly, try to analyze it, try to make sure it's really clarity and not just a fleeting thought. And in doing so, we scare it away. Like trying to catch a bird by lunging at it instead of staying still and letting it land on your hand. The thing you want is willing to come to you, but only if you can bear to stop chasing it. Only if you can trust that not trying, in this case, is the deepest form of trying. And that the clarity you've been working so hard to find has been waiting, this whole time, for you to be quiet enough to notice it was already there. There are things you already know that you keep trying to learn. Truths you've already understood that you keep seeking to understand again, as if they might be different this time, more true, more convincing, more permanent. You know that worry doesn't help. You know that most of what you fear won't happen. You know what matters to you, what you value, what makes you feel alive. But knowing doesn't feel like enough. So you keep searching for a version of that knowing that will finally satisfy, that will finally let you rest. And in the searching, you move away from the understanding you already have. This happens because the mind doesn't trust its own knowledge unless that knowledge feels earned. If something becomes clear too easily, if you understand it without having to work for it, there's a sense that it might not be real understanding. It might be superficial. It might not count. So you test it. You question it. You go looking for confirmation in books, teachers, frameworks that might validate what you already know. And sometimes that's useful. But other times, it's just a way of refusing to trust yourself. A way of saying, I'll believe this when someone smarter than me tells me it's true. Not because you doubt the truth itself, but because you doubt your right to know it without external authority. And there's something exhausting about this. About having to constantly relearn things you never actually forgot. About having to seek permission to trust your own experience. About needing to verify every insight, every moment of clarity, every understanding that arises naturally from having lived and paid attention. It keeps you perpetually dependent on external sources, perpetually in the position of student rather than knower. And that position has its comforts, but it also has its costs. One cost is that you never get to fully rest in what you know. You never get to say, I understand this, and it's enough. There's always the possibility that deeper understanding is waiting, that you haven't really gotten it yet, that you need to keep looking. But what if you let yourself rest? What if you said, I already know this, and allowed that to be sufficient? Not in an arrogant way, not claiming to know more than you do, but simply acknowledging what's actually clear. The things you don't have to think about to know. The things that are true in your direct experience, whether anyone validates them or not. There's a kind of dignity in this. A kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself, but that changes how you move through the world. You stop seeking quite so desperately. Stop questioning quite so relentlessly. Stop needing every understanding to be earned through struggle before you'll trust it. And in that stopping, in that resting, the understandings you already have get to sink deeper. Get to become not just intellectual knowledge, but lived wisdom. The kind that doesn't need to be remembered because it's woven into how you see, how you respond, how you are. And that kind of wisdom, the kind that comes from resting in what you already know rather than constantly seeking something beyond it, that's what actually changes you. Not the search, the resting. There's a certain kind of mind that can't leave well enough alone. Something is working, functioning, bringing good results. And instead of appreciating that, the mind starts picking at it, questioning whether it's really working, whether it could work better, whether there's a flaw hidden somewhere that hasn't revealed itself yet. This masquerades as diligence, as quality control, as the mark of someone who doesn't settle for good enough. But underneath, it's often just discomfort with things going well. A kind of superstition that if you're not worrying, if you're not analyzing, if you're not finding problems, then problems will find you. You see this in relationships sometimes. Things are good, genuinely good, and one person starts questioning whether they're too good. Whether this ease means something's wrong, whether real love is supposed to be harder, whether the absence of drama means the absence of depth. So they create tests, manufacture conflicts, push against the very thing that's working to see if it breaks. Not because there's evidence it needs to break, but because the mind has learned to distrust ease. It has learned that struggle is normal, that difficulty is proof of something real, and that when things feel simple, it must mean you're not paying attention, you're not being careful, you're missing something. Or you see it in work. You develop a system that functions well, that produces results, that makes your life easier. And instead of using the time and energy that frees up for other things, you start tweaking the system, optimizing it, looking for ways to make it 3% more efficient. Not because 3% matters, but because the mind needs a project. It needs something to figure out, something to improve, something to worry about. And if there's no real problem, it will invent one. It will find the one small thing that could theoretically be better and turn that into a reason to dismantle what's working. Because what's working doesn't give the mind anything to do. And the mind, having been trained to always be doing something, can't tolerate that. This habit costs more than we realize. It costs us the ability to enjoy what's working, to feel relief, to appreciate stability. Every good thing becomes temporary, held under suspicion, subject to constant evaluation. And the evaluation itself, the questioning, the checking, it creates a kind of background anxiety that colors everything. You can't fully relax into anything because part of you is always monitoring, always looking for the sign that it's about to fall apart. And sometimes, in the looking, you create the falling apart. You question someone until they become defensive. You adjust a system until it stops working. You think your way out of a clarity that was serving you perfectly well. Not because the thing itself failed, but because you couldn't let it succeed without interference. And then the mind uses that failure as evidence. See, it says, good thing I was being careful. Good thing I was questioning. as if the questioning wasn't the very thing that caused the problem it was trying to prevent. The drive to improve yourself can look like health, like growth, like someone taking responsibility for their life. And sometimes it is those things. But other times, underneath the language of growth and improvement, there's anxiety. A feeling that who you are right now isn't acceptable, that you need to be different, better, more disciplined, more aware, more healed before you're allowed to rest. And this feeling never quite names itself as anxiety. It calls itself aspiration. It calls itself self-love. It calls itself wanting to be your best self. But the body knows. The body feels the tension of never being enough, of always being a project, of having to earn the right to exist as you are through continuous improvement. You can see this in the way people talk about themselves. They say, "I'm working on being more present. I'm working on my boundaries. I'm working on letting go of perfectionism." Everything is work. Everything is something to be fixed or developed or achieved. And there's rarely a moment where they say, "This part is fine as it is. This part doesn't need work. This part is actually already complete." Because to say that would feel like complacency. It would feel like you've given up, like you're settling, like you're one of those people who isn't committed to growth. And we've been taught to fear being that person more than we fear exhausting ourselves in the pursuit of an ever-receding standard. But constant improvement has a cost that's rarely discussed. It creates a relationship with yourself where you're always the evaluator and the evaluated, always the teacher and the failing student, always the one pointing out flaws, setting new goals, measuring progress. And in that dynamic, where is the kindness? Where is the simple appreciation for the fact that you woke up today, that you're doing your best, that you're here? It gets buried under the improvement project. It becomes conditional. I'll appreciate myself when I've meditated for 30 days straight. I'll be kind to myself when I've overcome this pattern. I'll rest when I've earned it. But the earning never ends. The bar keeps moving. Because the anxiety underneath isn't really about whether you're good enough. It's about whether you have the right to stop trying to be better. And the strange thing is, real growth often happens when you stop trying to grow. When you give yourself permission to just be for a while. To exist without a project, without a goal, without having to prove anything. In that space, with that relief, changes happen naturally. Not because you forced them, but because you stopped forcing. But getting to that space requires recognizing the anxiety that's been driving the improvement agenda. Recognizing that self-improvement can become another way to reject yourself. Another way to say, you're not okay as you are. And once you see that, once you feel how heavy it is to always be working on yourself, you might decide to put the work down for a while. Not forever. Not as a rejection of growth, but as an experiment in resting. In seeing what happens when you're not trying to be better, when you're just here. Just this. Just enough. When things get quiet, when there's no noise to fill the space, the mind panics a little. Not obviously, maybe, but there's a subtle reaching, a sudden need to check your phone, to put on music, to start a conversation, to think about something, anything, rather than sitting with the silence. And this reaction is interesting, because silence isn't dangerous. It's not uncomfortable in itself. What's uncomfortable is what silence reveals. All the thoughts you've been avoiding by staying busy. All the feelings you've been outrunning by staying in motion. All the truths you know but haven't wanted to look at directly. Silence acts like a mirror. It shows you what's actually there when you remove all the distractions, all the noise, all the constant doing. And often, what's there isn't peaceful. It's restless. It's anxious. It's a mind that doesn't know how to just be, that only knows how to react, how to process, how to fill every gap with content. And seeing that, feeling that, can be deeply uncomfortable. It can feel like something's wrong with you. Like you should be able to sit in silence without this restlessness, this urge to escape. Like other people probably can, and your inability to do so is another thing that needs fixing. But maybe it's not about fixing. Maybe the discomfort is just information. Your mind has been trained to always be engaged with something external. Always consuming, always processing, always responding to stimulus. That's how it learned to operate. And now, in silence, it doesn't have that stimulus, and it doesn't know what to do with itself. So it creates its own. It starts thinking about problems. It starts planning. It starts reviewing the past or rehearsing the future. Anything to avoid the present, because the present, in silence, is too simple. There's nothing to do with it. Nothing to figure out. You can only be in it. And being, without doing, is a skill most of us have never developed. So silence becomes a practice, in a way. Not a practice of achieving silence externally, but a practice of staying with what silence reveals. Letting the restlessness be there without immediately trying to fix it or escape it. Noticing the urge to reach for distraction and choosing, sometimes, not to reach. And in that choosing, in that staying, something gradually shifts. The silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling spacious. The absence of noise stops feeling like something missing and starts feeling like relief. And the thoughts that arise, instead of being problems to solve or distractions to chase, become just weather passing through. They come, they go, and underneath them is something quiet. Something that was there all along, but that you couldn't hear over the noise. Not truth, exactly. Not some grand realization. Just a kind of restfulness. A sense that you don't have to keep doing, keep thinking, keep improving, keep understanding. You can just be here, in the silence, with whatever is. And that, in itself, is enough. The mind craves closure. It wants stories to have endings. It wants questions to have answers. It wants every uncertainty to resolve into certainty, every ambiguity to clarify into something definite. And this makes sense. Closure feels safe. It feels like you can finally relax, finally stop holding the question, finally move on. But life doesn't always offer closure. People leave without explanation. Situations end without resolution. You never find out what happened, why things went the way they did, what it all meant. And the mind struggles with this. It keeps circling back, trying to construct an explanation, trying to create closure where none was given. But there's a different way to hold these things. A way that allows understanding without requiring closure. It means recognizing that you can know something is over without knowing why. You can accept that something happened without needing the full story. You can let someone go without getting the conversation that explains everything. And this isn't resignation. It's not giving up on understanding. It's understanding differently. It's understanding that some questions don't have answers you'll ever access, and that your peace can't be conditional on getting those answers. This is hard, especially for people who've learned to use thinking as a way to feel and control. Because thinking usually does create a sense of control. You think through a problem, you understand it, you know what to do. But when thinking can't give you what you need, when there's simply no more information to work with, thinking becomes a trap. It loops endlessly, constructing explanations that might be true or might not be, rehearsing conversations that will never happen, trying to force closure through sheer mental effort. And all of that effort doesn't bring peace. It brings exhaustion. Letting go of the need for closure doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean the situation doesn't matter. It means you acknowledge that you've understood as much as you're going to understand with the information available. That further thinking won't reveal anything new because there's nothing new to reveal. And in that acknowledgement, there's a kind of completion. Not the completion of having all the answers, but the completion of recognizing you don't need them to move forward. The story can be unfinished, and you can still close the book. The question can remain unanswered, and you can still put it down. And when you do, when you finally stop trying to force closure, what often emerges is a different kind of understanding. Not an understanding of what happened or why, but an understanding that you're okay without knowing. That you can hold uncertainty without it consuming you. That closure was never really about the external situation resolving. It was about you giving yourself permission to be at peace with things as they are. Unresolved. Incomplete. And somehow, beautifully enough. There comes a point where you realize you don't have to resolve everything before you rest. That rest isn't something you earn by finishing all your thinking, solving all your problems, understanding everything that confuses you. Rest can come in the middle, while things are still unclear, while questions remain unanswered, while life is still messy and complicated and uncertain. And this realization changes something fundamental. It means you're no longer holding yourself hostage to resolution. You're no longer saying, I'll be at peace when. You're allowing peace now, with everything exactly as it is. This doesn't mean you stop caring about the unresolved things. It doesn't mean you abandon questions or stop seeking clarity when clarity matters. It just means you recognize that resting and seeking aren't opposites. You can rest between seekings. You can rest while still holding questions. You can be at peace with not knowing, at least for now, at least for this moment. And that capacity, that ability to rest without everything being resolved, is maybe the deepest form of trust. Trust that you don't have to have it all figured out. Trust that you're safe even in uncertainty. Trust that your well-being doesn't depend on having answers. And once you experience this, even briefly, it becomes easier to choose. You notice when you're withholding rest from yourself, making it conditional, telling yourself you'll relax once this one thing is settled. And you can recognize that pattern for what it is. Not wisdom, not responsibility, just fear disguised as diligence. Fear that if you rest before resolving, you'll never resolve. Fear that if you're at peace with uncertainty, you'll become complacent. But the opposite is usually true. When you rest, when you're genuinely at peace, you think more clearly. You see options you couldn't see when you were tight with anxiety. You move with more ease, more grace, more effectiveness. So maybe the work isn't to resolve everything. Maybe the work is to rest more deeply, to let yourself be here, now, with whatever is true right now, without needing it to be different or complete or finished. To trust that the questions will still be there tomorrow if they need to be. That the thinking you need to do will happen when it needs to happen. That you don't have to hold on to everything so tightly. You can let it go for a while. You can close your eyes. You can breathe. And in that breathing, in that letting go, you might discover something you've been looking for all along. Not a final answer. Not a complete understanding. Not a resolution to every question. Just this quiet, simple, always available truth. That you're here. That you're okay. That even without knowing, even without understanding, even without anything being resolved, you can rest. You can be still. You can let the searching quiet down for a while and just be present with what is. And in that presence, that stillness, that willingness to be here without needing anything to change, there's a kind of completion that has nothing to do with endings. A wholeness that was never actually broken. A peace that was never actually dependent on having all the answers. It was just waiting, patient and quiet, for you to stop looking long enough to notice it was already here.